Today we're looking at diseases in modern history, bubonic plague, smallpox, and the influenza of 1918. We're going to describe the bubonic plague, smallpox, influenza of 1918. We're going to connect those into HIV/AIDS and COVID-19. We want to understand their impact on human societies and examine the conflicts caused by social reactions to these diseases. So before we really get into it, humans and disease, those two just, kind of go hand in hand historically. We are just one species that lives among many other species out there. Some are large, like animals. Others are microscopic. In this case, pathogens. What we're talking about here. Humans, since we, first started walking this earth and interacting in the environment, we've been exposed to different types of bacteria, different types of viruses, different types of parasites. Sometimes we encounter diseases that are incredibly virulent, that really kind of threaten us in terms of our ability to maintain our social functions. Most of the time, though, these are rare instances. Most of the time, these diseases are just simply ones that cause us a little bit of inconvenience, especially after our body adjusts to them, and then we move on. So in this case, what we're looking at is we're going to be looking at just a handful of diseases that, out of all the different diseases we could look at. I mean, there's so many different types of them. Generally just the big ones in terms of having, this long-lasting impact on American society, on human societies. So again, we could choose a number. We could choose cancer and put it in there. We could put polio in here. We could put cholera in here. So many, Ebola. There's just so many different types of diseases out there. But these are just kind of like some of the standards that I'm going to introduce you to. So the very first one we're looking at is bubonic plague, and this one came really early in modern history, the early modern era, and its origins was in Asia. Now, when COVID-19 broke out, one of the big concerns, like in the United States of America, for example, was the origin of the disease. People started engaging in hate crimes against Asian Americans because they associated the disease with an American economic rival, China. They let their fear get the better of them, and they began to target these people, believing that somehow Asia is the cause of all viruses. And this isn't the case. Viruses come from a number of different sources. A lot of viruses that we deal with, though, tend to be what are called zoonotic. They have their origins with animals. Smallpox, we believe, is just one of many of those. So, human beings, we started domesticating plants and animals roughly around 10,000 years ago. As we started living, next to our pigs and our horses and our cattle, the diseases that they had would sometimes jump to us and infect our bodies, and then we would have to get used to it. So when you take a look at, Asia, why Asia? Well, it's, heavily populated. It's got, some climate areas there that are, very diverse. All the major climate areas are there in one way or the other. Just kind of a matter of, I guess you could say, statistics. Right climate, right animals, right humans, just happens to be there. Boom, disease mutates, hops to a human being. But Asia is not always the place, the ground zero for a number of diseases. We've had some nasty diseases come out of, say, the Middle East. MERS, COVID-V, in 2013 that luckily didn't jump to the human population, or really didn't spread. We didn't get community spread with it. That would have been a bad one. You got Ebola in Africa, malaria rampant in tropical Africa. And then when we get to the influenza of 1917, here's an H1N1 influenza strain. It's going to start on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. It's going to start in the United States and become misnamed as the Spanish influenza for a long time before we finally realized, oh no, this was an American-bred disease. So this is just one disease, and it happened to have its origins in Asia, and it spread from Asia through Central Asia, and first, infected Europeans that were trading in the Ottoman port of Kaffa on the Black Sea. And then from there, it went to the one place of all places that you don't want a disease to pop up in early modern Europe, and that is Italy. One thing about Europe is, after the collapse of the Romans, urban life really diminished. A large city was maybe 50 to 100,000 people, except for one place, and that was what we call Italy today. Of course, Italy didn't exist at this time. There was a bunch of different kingdoms. But here, in what is modern-day Italy, there were a lot of densely packed large cities. This was still largely urban. And one thing about diseases is the first thing you have to ask is, okay, what is their origin? Is it zoonotic? Where did it come from? This was a zoonotic disease. The second thing was, is it a crowd? Does it thrive in crowds? In this case, bubonic plague did. It needs densely packed environments of humans, or environments of densely packed humans to really thrive. Some diseases are just endemic to a region. A good example of this is if you go to tropical Africa, not all Africa, tropical Africa. This is a place where malaria is endemic. It's found year-round, constantly. And it's caused by a parasite transmitted by mosquitoes, so it's there in the environment. In the case of bubonic plague, it needs these human bodies tightly packed together to constantly spread and reproduce. So it pops up here in 1347 in Genoa, this Italian town right here, and then from there it's going to go packed on these Italian ships. And keep in mind, Italians at this time, they were the major merchants of the Mediterranean for Europe, and it's going to spread to other ports. And it's caused by this disease, Yersinia pestis. And initially what happened with Yersinia pestis is it was a disease found in the bellies of fleas. So it needed fleas in order to transmit. That was the vector. And by the time Yersinia pestis gets done with Europe, it will reduce the population by a third. And in fact, there will be some counties in Italy that will be, the statistics, when you go back and you look at, the records, especially from church records, they'll record deaths of up to about 2/3 of a county population. Some areas, the death toll is going to be staggering. In other areas, though, as you can see from, Eastern Europe, basically modern-day Poland, Belarus, going to remain largely untouched. So what happened with the bubonic plague? Well, it mutated. This happens with diseases. So in the case of bubonic plague, initially it needed that rat bite, that flea bite. And when it starts infecting people, what were the infections like? Well, you got this fever, it can be extreme. It causes necrosis under the skin, especially in the swelling of the lymph nodes. So necrosis under the skin, that's where it got that nickname Black Death from. And then the lymph nodes would swell up, like around the armpits and the neck to large sizes. And, it's this ghastly sight. But you could potentially survive, the statistics weren't high, but you could potentially survive bubonic plague in its earliest forms. But as it was spreading throughout, eventually what will happen is that it will switch from a type of disease that really relies on transmission through a flea bite to a septicemic version. So it's going into the bloodstream. It's reproducing in the bloodstream. And then from, the bloodstreams, it eventually is going to become pneumonic, so affecting the lungs. And when this happened, it basically became airborne. And these were actually the worst cases that you could possibly get of bubonic plague, where once the symptoms hit you and you were affected and you were showing, and it was in its full course, you're talking about fatalities within about a day and a half. So what happened to Europe as a result of this? Well, socially, there's going to be a collapse, basically, of social functions in some of the hardest hit places. When you're talking about counties that are experiencing a third mortality, sometimes even higher, you're starting to talk about the loss of essential services and workers. Back then you needed your laborers to plant fields, to harvest fields. You had your what we would call law enforcement, like in England they would refer to them as like sheriffs. Basically the soldiers, the military that provided stability and security, they're lacking. And so what's happening is you're starting to see a lot of banditry. In this time period, of course, the nobility, they were the political leaders. They were the ones that made big decisions. If they're disappearing, there's nobody there to, make those decisions. And then the worst case scenario here is the church. Back in this time period, the church provided a number of functions, one of which was medical. So some of the orders, the religious orders of the Catholic Church, like the Cistercians, were the main places where medical research was taking place. And so, a lot of these church doctors would provide healing services for the surrounding community. They would nurse people. They would help during outbreaks. Nuns, monks, they're in these monasteries, they're in the churches, they're being inundated with sickness and death. They're succumbing to it. In some cases, they're giving up their orders. And so when you have the loss of these folks, you're losing what is basically a decent size of your medical community in early modern Europe. And society starts to break down. Now, in the case of the bubonic plague, this was a time period where people still understood and processed the world around them through a religious lens. And so religion played a big role in people's reaction. They viewed this as God's punishment on the people on the earth. And so you had this not only revival of religious, observation and people going to church, and trying to root out sin and all this possible causes of God's anger, but it even took it to extremes. And so in the case of Catholicism during the bubonic plague, there was this increase in groups that we called flagellants, and these were folks that would whip themselves, physically injure themselves. And the idea was that they were trying to physically punish the body to shed sin and prepare the person for the afterlife. Now, all of these events are happening. Society's reacting. They're reacting often in fear and terror. They're reacting to, in some cases, social breakdown as these essential people are dying off. And then they start to look for an outlet. Who do we blame? Well, they didn't understand the idea of a disease, of an illness. So what they did is they fell back on old hatreds that had been around for a long time. In this case, anti-Semitism. So usually Jewish populations within communities were the first ones to be targeted as poisoners and people that brought this death. And in some cases, it would get to such a fever pitch that the papacy itself had to start to issue bulls saying, hey, you need to stop doing this. You need to stop your attacks on these communities. So very, very turbulent time that was caused by this one illness. And one thing that did happen, though, is as a result of it, things will change, though. When you're talking about losing a third of your population, there are going to be some serious changes. And the first case was, with laborers. laborers become so in such short supply that they're able to demand more for their work. And so you started to see the basic standard of living for your common laborer increasing, being able to buy better clothes, live in better houses, that kind of stuff. Also, we started to see technological innovations that historians have said was, possibly credited, possibly a need caused by this shortage of labor. And it's this technological innovation, it's this need to start using your mind that historians originally believe laid the foundation for the Renaissance, which was the rebirth of classical knowledge in Europe. Now, today, is the bubonic plague gone? And the answer is no. It's still around with us. You will occasionally hear of outbreaks throughout the world, and usually they're nowadays, instead of densely populated places, they're usually outbreaks in like rural areas. So in Central Asia, for example, there was a scare when a young kid killed I think it was a marmot for his lunch or his dinner. In the flea on the animal, jumped to him, bit him, infected him with the disease. He spread it, but now we know about bubonic plague. We know how to treat it. We know how to contain it. We have systems in place to rapidly react, and so usually they're small outbreaks. Other times you'll hear about bubonic warnings out in places like Western United States, where it's still found, especially in the rodent population, like squirrels. So not, probably around 2019, 2018, there was an alarm sent out that the squirrels population of Colorado was showing signs of infection with bubonic plague. And in this case, it was a simple way of dealing with it, just warning the public not to interact with squirrels. Don't feed them, don't get close to them. And this is something we learned from the bubonic plague. It's one thing we learned through these pandemics is what to do and what not to do. So during the bubonic plague, what was one of the first things that people started doing? Well, they started going out and killing cats. They assumed that the cats, which was an animal associated with the devil back then, were to blame for their illnesses. Well, we know today that was a really dumb idea. Not only were they killing cats, they're going out and killing the rats themselves. Well, so long as the rat is alive, the flea's probably going to stay on the rat. The cat is there to help contain the rat population. If you start going on this mass extermination, well, now you're getting these fleas jumping to human beings, and it's actually causing you more problems than good. So today, we've learned from our past mistakes, at least in most situations, and we have measures in place. Now, another major disease in human history, the one that really kind of stuck with us, though, was smallpox. This one was most likely zoologic, because there are forms of this type of disease in other animals. And this disease caused by the variola virus, not the virola virus. So that should be VARIOLA. Misspelled that. Sorry about that. See if I can use my pad here to correct it. The variola virus. It's found in other animals as well. Like there's what we call a cowpox that we're eventually going to develop. Sorry, folks. I'm trying to use my trackpad on my laptop to do this. Variola virus that causes it. And, it's found in similar strains of viruses are found in other animals too. So most likely, when we were domesticating animals in antiquity, this goes all the way, way, way back, 2000, 1000 BCE. That's where it first jumped. And in this particular instance, the symptoms are pretty nasty. Usually, you can walk around with this disease for like a good 2 weeks before you start becoming symptomatic, which is really bad because during those 2 weeks you're also infectious, and you're talking about a log infection range because it's spread through water molecules, it's spread through contact, So, if you're sitting on it, one of the reasons why we're so afraid of, a terrorist group getting like smallpox or a rogue nation getting smallpox and releasing it is, you could be asymptomatic sitting on a plane, coughing or, just doing whatever and basically infecting all those people on there. So very infectious. When it does finally hit you at the symptoms are nasty. When you get rashes that really kind of start like, in the mouth area, they'll go from the core and they'll spread outward. And these poxes that form, these pustules, can be very painful. They can leave you scarred. They can cause deformities. It causes high fever, can cause delirium, and depending on what kind you get determines on whether or not you're going to survive it. So usually what happened with smallpox in European society was that, in not just European, but all societies that have been exposed to it, is that they had been exposed to it generation after generation. So usually, like once this is like the chickenpox. In fact, the chickenpox is very similar. It's kind of a same type virus. Just like with chickenpox, once you get smallpox, you've had it. You're done. You've got the immunity. So you'd go through bouts where adults were getting infected, and then they would develop the antibodies, the immunities within their system, and then through childbirth and pregnancy, the mother would usually transmit some of these antibodies to children. And usually in European society, if you got infected when you were a child, when you still had these protections. And so in most cases, it was unpleasant, but you could survive it. The one thing that you hoped is that you got a type of smallpox known as discrete smallpox. And so these are the small little kind of pustules that don't break open. And best case scenario, especially for young women during this time period, was that it stayed away from the face. You didn't want to be, because once the pox went away, then it could leave you pock marked. And so for young ladies, unfortunately, legally they still relied on marriage for degrees of economic stability and well-being and mobility. And this was a time period where a young lady's appearance could still affect her marriage prospects. So usually you hope to get it young, you hope to get the discrete type, you hoped it stayed away from your face, and then you were done with it. This wasn't always the case. You could always get hemorrhagic smallpox. This was like started to break and bleed through. There's also another type of smallpox where basically the poxes would kind of like form on each other. These types were actually highly lethal, and so if you got those, chances of death was pretty high. But again, in most Europeans, you got it young and you survived it, and then you passed the immunity on to the next generation. Now, smallpox played a major role in history because of the Columbian Exchange. And keep in mind, when the continent started breaking apart, there's this very brief period where the Western Hemisphere and the Eastern Hemisphere will be reconnected, usually through the Bering Land Bridge. And there will be a transfer of organisms, of animals and plants and humans in between the two hemispheres. But then there's this long period where, everything shuts down. The ability to go back and forth, stops. And it just so happens that this coincides with the beginning of plant and animal domestication in Europe. And so Europeans and Eurasians as a whole, and Africans are going to be exposed to some of these diseases that Native Americans were not. And one of them is smallpox. So when Europeans arrived in the Americas, they brought with them smallpox, and it devastated Native American communities because there was no prior exposure. This was a fresh population, untouched population being exposed for the first time. And so, you would read, from the records of Europeans going to Native American villages and seeing dead bodies everywhere. People trying to obviously looked like they were trying to crawl to get water or to get food or something, and they're just covered in smallpox. And this actually goes down and it's burned into Native American Native American mind and religion. So a good example is the Plains natives. After contact began to have in their religious stories and traditions a figure that would appear in some of their stories about the world as a white man dressed in black who carried with him death, and this was smallpox. In 1830s, there were some really nasty smallpox outbreaks in the Great Plains that left the Arikara, Hidatsa, and Mandans just decimated. If you take a look at the collapse of Tenochtitlan by Cortez, was it Cortez and his brave 600 men, all protected by armor and riding horses, that led to the downfall of the Aztecs? Absolutely not. It was, first of all, the massive army that he had generated or put together of the Aztecs' enemies. But we know today that when the Spaniards attacked Tenochtitlan, smallpox had broken out, and it laid the warriors, out with this nasty illness, and so there was no one really there to defend the city against the Spaniards. And so what will happen is, because of diseases like smallpox, the death toll will be so high among Native Americans that between disease, between changes in the environment, cultural upheavals, and then conflict, what Alfred Cosby, a leading environmental historian, has called a demographic takeover will basically occur in the West. Now, eventually what will happen is that in really beginning in the 1700s, people will learn to defend themselves against smallpox. It starts with variolation. So variolation comes from the word variola, variola virus, smallpox. It's where you literally cut open like one of the pustule-filled pustules, and you take some of that pus and you literally cut into another person's skin, and you put that stuff up in there. And what that did is, you first off, you chose your patient, your sick patient, very carefully. You made sure that this person had discrete smallpox. But then you would take that smallpox and infect other people with it, because it would basically give them a more tame version of the disease that they could survive. And so this variolation, which carried with it some risk, especially if you chose the wrong person, if you did not follow quarantine procedures, there was risk, but it was successful. And then not long after that, within about 100 years, you're going to have true inoculation, in which they're going to take a virus from the cowpox and use that to introduce that into people, where it doesn't really cause a reaction, but you still get, it doesn't cause sickness, but it causes an immune response that protects against smallpox. So these will be the very first ones, and it'll be used throughout the 1800s and into the 1900s, until finally, after World War II, we begin to use modern vaccines, modern medical procedures to start a worldwide, a global program of eradication that succeeded in 1977. So since 1977, we haven't had any natural outbreaks of smallpox globally. Now, the next disease that we can take a look at is the influenza of 1918. So, bubonic plague started in Eurasia, smallpox somewhere in Eurasia. I would say, if you want to know where, probably check one of the original culture hearts of urbanization. For influenza, this is one of those ones that kind of shows that not all diseases start in one place. No, disease happens everywhere. So in this case, influenza of 1918 originally was known as the Spanish influenza. We know today that it should really probably be named the American influenza, because the first records of it occurred at Fort Riley, Kansas, where a very nasty and very lethal form of H1N1 flu broke out. And H1N1 flu, by the way, this is a type of flu virus that can be transmitted from pigs. So around 2008, there was the swine flu outbreak that caused a lot of fear. And swine flu was an H1N1 type flu virus. So it starts in Fort Riley, Kansas. Doctors are, just perplexed about this type of influenza that's, cutting through this young population, causing breathing difficulties, very painful. But just as quickly as it began, it disappeared. And what we believe happened is that the disease itself didn't disappear. It just, possibly mutated, possibly went dormant. But the young men probably took it with them to Europe, to the trenches, where it began to get passed around in those trenches, picked up the nickname Spanish influenza eventually as a result of this location. But then they come back with it, fall, winter of 1918. And where do we start to see the very first outbreaks? Well, you started to hear about newspaper reports of influenza cases picking up in places like Boston, port cities where these young men were coming back, and causing some fatalities. So that's August. In September, now you're hearing about more cities, more fatalities. By October, you're talking about fatalities hitting the 200,000s, and then you're off to the races. When flu season gets fully underway. And by the time it's all said and done, we'll probably never know how many exactly people died from influenza. But there have been reports of up to maybe 30 million worldwide could have died from it. Again, never truly, or maybe 20, not the 30, but 20 million worldwide. But again, we'll never really truly know because not all countries were taking close you're keeping close medical records during this time period. So what basically happens? Well, if you take a look at the United States of America, it too had social effects. First off, you had to have some quarantine methods in place, and cities started to do this. They started requiring people to stay at home. They started requiring certain businesses to shut down. They started barring large gatherings of people. They required masks to be worn. Of course, this caused a backlash. People were worried about business. People didn't want to wear the mask. People didn't want to listen to the medical advice. And so, there have been some reports that have come out and that have showed, that those cities that actually went in and, locked down first, kept these quarantines in place longest, tended to have, lower peaks in terms of cases and fatalities, and came out of it with a better recovery rate than those that, were really lax in their quarantine measures. But again, there was this social divide. A lot of people didn't want to pay attention to this. So, if you went down America, you would find, like in some neighborhoods, health authorities going and marking houses saying, okay, there's sickness here, there's death here, stay away from here. During this time period, if you owned a mortuary, if you were a carpenter that could build a coffin, you were going to make a killing, no pun intended. Little kids were actually going out and making nursery rhymes about the disease, one of which was, I had a little bird, its name was Enza, I opened the window in influenza. That was a popular rhyme that you'd probably hear little kids skipping rope to out there on the side of the road. But even though you had all this death around you, you still had people that refused to curtail their lives. And so there was, some conflict, especially between the authorities in cities trying to enforce quarantines. There was a religious effect. People did view this as God's judgment on America, on a sinful world. And even though you had these quarantine measures in place, you still had people going to these mass gatherings at churches, no masks, no protection, no nothing. and engaging in religious services. Like Billy Sunday was a big popular preacher in this time period. He was known to keep having his gatherings, and so you have this kind of dueling tendencies within society. On the one hand, you do have medical officials that are convincing most cities to enact quarantine measures, but then you have the people as a whole that aren't listening to the medical professionals. And what are they doing? They're still gathering, and they're spreading the disease. So again, influenza, by the time it's over in 1918, you're talking about millions of deaths worldwide. But we did learn some things from it in terms of quarantining procedures. We did get the statistics back. We can look at the statistics today and see at how quarantining measures did. It didn't destroy the virus, but it curtailed people's exposure to it. So the medical field itself, in terms of how it treats and how it, what it does with patients once they bring them into this building, all these things help to create some of the mechanisms that have been used to combat disease on a global level since then. So, if you want to look at the birth of, like, say, the Centers for Disease Control, if you want to look at the birth of organizations like the World Health Organization, it's in events like these in the 20th century. Now today, are we completely free of disease? Well, definitely not. I mean, we still have contemporary pandemics, and we still have, a lot of the controversy over how to react to it. So I say that we've learned lessons from events like the influenza of 1918. We have. We do know it works. But, even though it works, it doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to listen and follow that advice. It doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to always make the most rational decisions in times of turbulence. If we take a look at, say, HIV/AIDS, I mean, this is an example in modern times of catastrophe that is really kind of self-inflicted. So the human immunodeficiency virus that later, leads to full-blown AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency virus or syndrome, really broke out. It really hits, and we start seeing it really mid to late 1970s. And if you take a look at the United States of America, where did the first cases start? Well, they started popping up among the LGBTQ population, especially among gay men. Now, keep in mind what I said at the beginning of this. When it comes to diseases, a lot of things are statistics. Why is a disease likely to start in one spot as opposed to another? Well, it's the environment, it's the population density, it's all these factors that just make it statistically higher that it might happen here. Some cases it's just, it just happens this way. It can be just a random event. Is there any one explanation as to why it entered the gay population? No, not really at all. It just started there. But what happens? Well, without knowledge of what HIV/AIDS was, without the knowledge that it was transmitted through blood, that it was sexually transmitted infection, there was no way in the early stages to take precautionary measures against it. So it began to spread within the gay population. And CDC and the medical community started catching on to this illness that was, appearing within this community. And what was the reaction of political leadership and as well as some within the medical community? Well, it was to ignore it. They looked at this illness hitting gay American men, and they basically said, oh, well, it's a gay cancer. Keep in mind, this was a time of conservative resurgence in America. This is going to be the time period where, Billy Graham is, preaching to packed crowds. This is the time period where guys like Jerry Falwell are getting their real start. It's the time period of Ronald Reagan, looking back to America's heartland as the pinnacle of morals and virtue. It's a period where, we still have an Equal Rights Amendment, but it hasn't been passed yet because there's enough resistance to an amendment that says that women are equal to men in the Constitution. All this is happening here. And so what basically political leadership does is they just choose to ignore it. I mean, and you had some really nasty things that were said about, gay men at this time period and AIDS patients by political leadership. Jokes that they were cracking publicly that today you would think would end a political career, but back then it did nothing to them. So what basically happens? Well, there's a number of things that basically had to have happen. So instead of funding research, instead of promoting education, instead of talking about it, like President Ronald Reagan, for example, he never once said anything about it. He's never once mentioned it. At least not until his friend Rock Hudson dies of it. Before that, it's just non-existent. Just ignore the fact. And what's happening while political leaders are ignoring it, while social leaders are ignoring it, while schools are refusing to educate people? Well, we know it's passed through blood. We know it's a sexually transmitted infection, but nobody's getting the information that they needed. So eventually it takes community action to force leadership in this case to react. So from the influence of 1918, from all these other illnesses, we know how to contain an outbreak. We know about quarantine. We know what to do. They just weren't doing it because of the population that it hit. And so what happens? Well, first off, you have groups like ACT UP. This is the group that took the Purple Triangle, which was used during the Holocaust for gays and lesbians, and they used it as a symbol, for speaking out and educating people on HIV/AIDS. They began to do, not only did you have marches in the streets that were, tied into marches from, the gay rights movements that started, in the 1970s, but they're also doing marches to raise awareness of AIDS. To educate people that, it wasn't a gay cancer, that it was a bloodborne virus that could affect anybody. You had ACT UP, though, that would take these public demonstrations to a whole other level. And so in one case, they took, I think it was Jesse Helms. They took his house and they wrapped it in a condom, like this big kind of fake made-up condom. They would have die-ins, where people would lay out in the streets in front of offices, showing the victims of the HIV/AIDS plague. And then, you had other events as well, like Live Aid, this massive concert that was brought together by some of the leading musicians of their time period to, again, raise awareness. And it's really the people that have to force politicians to finally act. And one thing that really kind of helped move the needle on this was just simply the fact that patients started showing up in the heterosexual population. And once they started popping up in the heterosexual population, well, now suddenly politicians wanted to do something about it. And it's pretty sad because one thing that we can do is we can compare the way other countries reacted to it. And other countries that reacted quickly with especially with programs of just simple education, tended to fare much better in terms of containing the disease. But that didn't happen in the United States. So today, we're still trying to play catch up in terms of, just limiting its spread and, finding diseases, not diseases, but treatments for it. And, that even goes into COVID-19. So, as we know by now, COVID-19, when it broke out, spring, there's always a time period where we got to catch up. We got to find out where's it coming from, what's happening, how's it, transmitting. And in the early stages of COVID, we did have methods in place. We did have the CDC, and in fact, the CDC for the United States of America often provides the model for other countries worldwide. But what happened? Well, in this case, there were a number of factors, whether it was not maintaining enough stockpiles of emergency medical equipment. There was a lack of cooperation between our government and other world governments in developing a test. There was a resistance to community or to contact tracing, which is essential in just geographically tracking the disease. So we had the mechanisms, it's just in some cases we straight up didn't use them to help contain it. And then after that, the old arguments that we've seen since time immemorial came back. Is it is it right to shut down a house of worship during a pandemic? Some people said yes, some people said no. There was a call to wear masks, but some people said that individual freedom should trump health, community health. So these dueling tendencies within our, within society just popped back into the picture. So this is, again, it's been just a little bit of a foray, just a dipping our toe into the history of pandemics, really just since the early modern era. Keep in mind, there's a lot more stuff here, a lot of interesting history too. A lot of lessons that we can learn for today and for the future.